think the first thing I had wanted to get to is the fact that the sheriff's department, unlike any other kind of police department in Los Angeles County, uniquely prepares you for political office. And I'm just kind of curious, and like, what was that experience like for you? Going up the ranks and having to engage with citizens and basically being accountable to residents in ways that other police municipalities are not.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing people don't understand about the sheriff's department, they don't know the difference between, like, let's say, Los Angeles Police Department and the sheriff. A number of issues are what we're responsible for. So the sheriff is responsible for maintaining the jail. And the jail here in LA County is the largest in the nation, one of the largest. It's 23,000 beds over 9 campuses throughout the county. It's also the largest, has the 4th largest hospital here in LA County, because inmates also, it's like a little city inside. The largest mental health facility in LA County, and it's not just the people that are in the mental health facility are not there because they're just mentally ill. They're there because they committed crimes, and they're there. And then also the largest superior court system in the state. So, and then providing law enforcement services throughout all of Los Angeles County, county hospitals, county clinics, parks, golf courses, just it's a big responsibility. 1,000 square miles of ocean off here at the coast, Catalina Island and San Clemente. So, the service delivery, when I first came on in 1981, you're pretty naive to how big and how vast the department's responsibility is. But having grown up here in LA and South Central, and moved from Compton over to South Central LA, I intuitively knew that our service delivery, at least as a deputy, I was different, because I wasn't judgmental. I mean, we spoke off camera a little bit about my upbringing, and so I had as a non-law enforcement person growing up, I had seen interactions with law enforcement and people in my family, and I was very non-judgmental about the gang issues. I mean, I knew Stanley Williams, Tookie, and these guys, so I grew up with these guys. So my perspective as a young black cop was completely a little bit different, not completely different from the service delivery model that I'd seen out there in the past. So as I gained, rank in the organization and got more responsibility, for instance, when I made sergeant, I was pretty young, and Pete Wilson was governor. And if you recall back then, the AIDS epidemic was really just starting to come to fruition, and there were demonstrations, First Amendment right demonstrations. The LGBT community was really demonstrating heavily in West Hollywood, and rather than treat that First Amendment, gathering as we treat riots or disturbances, we actually facilitated that. I was a squad leader, and we, blocked the streets off for them, and it was really, really a successful exercise of First Amendment rights. And so that was really my first, toe in the water with dealing with large crowds of people who really were trying to exercise their rights, and there was no violence or anything involved. Fast forward a few years later, the Rodney King incident happened, and I was, a platoon sergeant out during the Rodney King incidents, and that was a whole different ballgame. It was much more violent. There was a lot of, fires and vandalisms and things like that. So, we addressed that differently. But even my own squad, the way we actually addressed that was much more, conducive to facilitating and understanding folks, before they, got angry with us.
I want to actually go ahead and get into your biography a bit. I want you to explain to me, or not explain, but tell me about your upbringing. I mean, I know you was born in Korea, and you grew up in an orphanage for a bit before you was adopted. Can you tell me about that experience and growing up in the city of Compton in South Los Angeles a bit?
Yeah, so my parents had been, my parents were both born before 1920. And they had been married 20 years before they even adopted me. And my dad was a World War II vet. After discharge from the service, they moved to Compton. And they had heard about this group called the Holt organization, and they literally picked me out of a photo album. And I was born in '59, and I flew over here before the end of the year, and they didn't go to Korea. They flew me over, and my first home was in Compton, and then shortly after they moved to South Central Los Angeles, where I grew up. And of course, we had family in Compton and South Central, so I went back and forth. When we moved to South Central in 1960, it was pretty, it's predominantly white, quite frankly. It was very integrated. It's very few black families. By the 65 riots, by 1968, we had, gentrification hadn't really happened. So I went to, Henry Clay Junior High, and I went to Washington High in South LA. By the time I graduated from Washington High in 1976, it was predominantly African American. I mean, there were very few Latinx, very few. There was one other Asian guy, a cat named Jerry Lee, who we were friends, and it was 99% black, at that time. So I grew up in the '60s, and so you have to remember the whole Black and I'm Proud. There was a lot of Black power movements going on at the time. The whole Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. I mean, these are people that were around, and I got to see them and see them on TV and experience that whole scene, right? Black Panthers, all that. So, it was interesting. It kind of shapes, you're kind of shaped by the generation you grow up in. And so that was, looking back on that, I'm really glad I actually lived during that time.
So growing up in that context, what made you want to become a police officer or join law enforcement?
I have to admit, joining law enforcement wasn't necessarily intentional. It wasn't something I always wanted to do. I may have mentioned earlier that, I've had interactions with, family members have had interactions with law enforcement. I've been stopped by law enforcement as a young man. But I started out as a lifeguard in 1976, working in inner city parks, and got to interact with the cops as well as the fire department, mainly the cops, because you work in these inner city pools and there's all this stuff going on. And so when I got out of, I went to Humboldt State University, which is up north. And when I got out of college, I applied for LAPD and the Sheriff's Department. I even had an application in for an insurance company. I think it was New York Life. So I was really kind of I was just looking for a job and a career. And my mom was funny because she said, despite all the stuff that happened in our family, she says, you have a degree. Why are you wasting your time being in the police? And I said, Mom, it's a career, it's benefits, it's a great job, it's respectable. So, with her blessing, I went ahead and applied. And, little did I know how successful I would be, but because you never know where fate's going to take you. And so, and then I that's how I got in. It wasn't something I had a lifelong desire to do.
Yeah, I was just wondering about that, and I was just curious if you end up having a sort of a change of perspective, living in Los Angeles and leaving for Humboldt University and then coming back. Because essentially by the time that you came back and joined the Sheriff's Department, the crack epidemic was just about to begin at that point. Things was getting a little bit dark in terms of gang violence is starting to emerge during the early to mid '80s.
Yes.
So I was just curious, was that part of the agenda? I mean, for yourself, and you managed to continue to work where you grew up. Right. That part about it. Yeah.
Well, I think, Humboldt was a whole different experience. There was only 40 black students up there out of 8,000. So having come from a 99% African-American or black high school and going into that environment, honestly, that was the first time I actually experienced racism. And you don't, when you grow up here in LA, particularly we tend to self-segregate ourselves, right? We grow up in these black communities or Latino. We kind of gravitate where our families are and where our community is. So when I went to Humboldt, there were no, mostly everybody was white, and I had a couple of white girlfriends, and I remember them telling me that they were not raised prejudiced. Their parents were totally on board with, they were very nice people. I couldn't go into their houses when I finally met their parents. I couldn't go in their houses. So that was my first experience with actual racism, and even up in Humboldt County was pretty interesting up there. But I loved it because I love nature. But getting back to what you're saying here in Los Angeles, because that's another thing, there's a big weed culture up there, even back then. I was very naive to it. But coming back to LA, I was always aware of the gang issue, but not keenly aware that crack was really just starting to be what it turned out to be. Because by the late 80s, I was already working undercover narcotics and working on a crack task force. So my intention was not to come in and really address that. It was just to come in and learn the craft. And, I was I was a little bit naive as to what police work was really about, and but I really thoroughly enjoyed it. And I remember the first week I was in Central Jail, I was shocked that this jail was downtown. And I ran into like 4 of my high school mates in jail. And I kind of joke with them, not realizing that there's this taboo about, the deputies talking to the inmates. And I'm like, hey, what's going on? And you were talking, and the other deputies are looking at me like I'm like, why does this dude know all these guys in jail? And I'm like, I went to high school with this cat, these guys. And so that was a whole nother dynamic that I thought was interesting. Because later on, when I was a lieutenant, one of the deputies asked me, why do you know so many people in custody? And I said, because in Los Angeles County here, we make a very small percentage of the population, but we make a huge part of the population in custody. And if, I've never left the inner city. I worked, those areas that I grew up in. And so you just tend to know people.
Right. And I would imagine that to a degree, you're an anomaly because you're probably one of the few officers who actually lived in the place that you're working.
Right.
And has that necessarily changed in law enforcement culture in Southern California in the county sheriff's department or any other department for that matter, to your knowledge?
Well, I think so. Intuitively, you have to realize that when I came on in the early 80s, there was not a lot of blacks on the department. And typically what happens is you try to, when you want to buy a home in LA, it was always very, cost prohibitive. When I first came on the sheriff's department, my first paycheck was like $600. And so, it's not like I'm going to go out and run out and buy a house. But when I was able to buy property, I did buy in the inner city. I bought in Leimert Park, and I spent 20 years living there. So, I just felt that it was important for me to just stay in my community and stay engaged. And I didn't fear our people. I didn't fear our culture. And I've always been embracing of the downtrodden and people that need help, because I had, as I mentioned, people in my family that have experienced these issues. And so, I've always felt comfortable working in environments where other people who maybe grew up in the valley or other places wouldn't feel comfortable.
The county sheriff's department, it's only been about 6 years since they went through a transformation where former Sheriff Lee Baca ended up having to go to jail. His undersheriff, Paul Tanak, went to jail after an FBI informant was being hidden in this jail system of the county sheriff's department, and a whole overhaul was to take place. And you even had to testify, against these commanders. Can you tell me a bit about what you saw during that period of time? I want you to explain what was happening and what was your relationship to it, witnessing this happening.
Yeah. Well, I didn't witness a lot of that. What I did was, when the phone was found by the deputy personnel, and the sheriff was, we have to put things into context. I think at the time the sheriff was getting ready to run for re-election.
Right.
And I think he feared that it was going to hurt his reelection. And so they panicked, I think, and this is just my conjecture because I wasn't in these inner circle conversations, but, they really did not want, they wanted to find out what was going on and what the FBI knew. So, I heard rumor of that, and I talked to the sheriff specifically, and even mentioned to then Mr. Tanaka, I worked undercover for the FBI, so you don't want to, I understand how investigations go. I worked internal affairs twice at 2 different ranks. And I said, you don't want to interfere with any kind of investigation. We know Steve Martin, we know the FBI, we know these guys personally. Talk to them, cooperate with them. And then I walled myself off. They walled me off of that because they knew I wasn't participating in that nonsense, and I actually got transferred over to run County Services Bureau. And they brought in Terry McDonald from the state. But more of my conversation happened with Lee after the indictments went down, because we were, once the indictments went down, I just thought, I'm not sure exactly what he was thinking about. And he called me in the office and asked me why I was upset. And I said, Sheriff, you're the leader of this organization, and there's 10 people who are not cops anymore because of your direction. And that was just disturbing to me. I mean, that his moral barometer and everybody's moral barometer that went to jail, kind of went so far askew that they didn't realize that no command officer can order you to do anything illegal. At one point I asked him, I said, didn't you see Mississippi burning? You cannot be bigger than the federal government. What was your end game here? You've got, how do you know that was the only inmate? How do you know that was the only phone? I've worked undercover, but there's many of us out there doing different things. And so I don't know that, I think he just had a huge lapse in judgment at the time. And the same with Paul. And the other personnel. I mean, there's people that were very good people that went to jail and should have known better. Actually, people think that, I got indicted and so I testified because of that. And that's absolutely not true, because there's a deputy who did cooperate and got indicted still. So, I just wasn't involved in any of that nonsense. And, somebody had to keep the ship floating and running while this nonsense was going on. And so at one point, my partner, who has since passed away, he got up one day and just left the office and never came back. And I was in charge of 18,000 people at that point, and so it was really a big challenge. It was a big challenge, but some things, life gives you the test and then you learn the lesson, right? And then I had studied leadership I have a master's in leadership. And so, your moral barometer has to be, bigger and always in sync with, your values. And my loyalty to the sheriff or any of these folks, did not outweigh my loyalty to what our profession was. And that's just the bottom line.
Now, what was interesting in the aftermath of those indictments and the sheriff races that took place then, the race in which the current sheriff, Alex Villanueva, won and became the new sheriff, it seemed like everyone understood the assignment that no one wants a corrupt sheriff's department. They knew the right things to say, the right tone to strike. Now that we're 4 years down the line after the 2018 election, how would you evaluate the public perception of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department and where it is now today under Alex Villanueva's leadership?
Yeah, under Alex. Well, you remember Jim McDonald was the sheriff, right?
Because Alex is so out there, we forget that Jim was actually the sheriff prior.
Yeah, so he had 4 years before that. So
right.
Yeah.
A matter of fact, let me revise my question. Actually, what are the differences that you see from in terms of the public perception of Jim McDonald's leadership versus that of Alex Villanueva, and the transformation of the department? Because it just strikes me as totally different.
Right.
There were no controversies. Let me stop talking. I'm saying after putting words in your mouth almost. So
yeah.
I just need you to tell me what your perspective
What the difference is between the two, yeah. So, I mean, look, I knew Jim, and I knew him when he was monitoring the department, I worked with him when he was in LAPD. So, Jim, he was a seasoned professional law enforcement executive. He knew how to run a relatively large organization, albeit he had never run one as large as the sheriff's department. He understood intuitively about management as well as leadership at that level. From my understanding, the unions felt like he was a little bit too harsh on them. And I think he came in with this, the attitude. LAPD guys, and I don't want to I'm not speaking poorly about LAPD at all, but people that come from LAPD and run organizations tend to emulate what LAPD does. And so they go back to their comfort zone and try to change the organization to be that. But the reality is, I think that, there was not a lot of controversy about Jim. I think the biggest thing I heard was them changing the buckles or something like that. But the reality is, under this leadership, Alex was a lieutenant, and that is, 6 rungs below the sheriff. And so when you're asking someone who knows how to fly a Cessna to not just fly a jumbo jet, you're asking them to take over the organization that builds the jumbo jets. It is a huge leap in terms of his perspective. I'm not saying that he's not a grown man, and I'm not saying he's not smart because he has a PhD. What I am saying is that there are certain things that prepare you for the next level. He had never been a captain, so he'd never really commanded a station. He had never really learned, the bigger picture of discipline. He'd never written policy. And so all of those things are starting to show, and the way he runs the department is very much in sync with hoping that the deputies like and support him. And I think that's one of the detriments to the organization because, the deputy's perspective is different, and as the manager, you got to make tough decisions, and not everybody is behaving in a certain way. They may not like all the policies that you want to, they don't even understand why the policy exists in some cases because they don't realize that as police managers, we're trying to protect the integrity of the entire profession, and some of the things that they do drive policy. And so understanding that, I think, is vitally important, and I think that's where a misconnect with the current sheriff is he was just too immature and inexperienced to be given that much power.
Mm-hmm. And can you name specifically the areas in which that really showed itself in terms of his leadership?
Well, immediately reinstating somebody who had been fired for more than a year for domestic violence and stalking and those issues, that was not only intuitively wrong, it was actually just it just lacked a tremendous amount of common sense, and I don't understand what the loyalty was or why that even happened. And then pushing back against the board of supervisors on a number of issues, and it just led to a deterioration of that relationship over the last 4 years, and so. Those are some of the specifics that we can get into. And what happens is no matter how well-intentioned he is in terms of doing things out in the future, it's not really appreciated because of the manner in which he delivers that service.
As you've been running for office, it's kind of hard to imagine anyone consider you a controversial figure. Given your long history in the department and all the service you've done in different capacities. But you have a candidate, I believe his name is Eric Strong, who I think is coming at you from your left, basically. I think that's what's going on. And I'm just kind of curious. I believe he's also younger than you, right?
Yes.
Different
Everybody's
generation.
younger than me. So.
Different generation. It's like right now, I'm sort of throwing a lot of mess against the wall and see what sticks, is what I've seen so far in the comments. But what do you think is happening right now in terms of, what kind of critique are they trying to form about your candidacy that you imagine that's happening right now?
You mean my opponents? Yeah. I think they're trying, one of the common things that Eric tries to point out is that he doesn't believe I did anything about the deputy cliques or gangs in the sheriff's department when I was there. And I keep, every chance I get, I let people know. I started what's called the Deputy Leadership Institute. I've taught classes at the Academy for Leadership. I didn't tolerate that kind of behavior under my command. And what people have to realize is that I wasn't never the sheriff. Once the sheriff, him or herself, there's never been a female sheriff, but once there's the sheriff himself going back to Biscaloos, if you get these guys that I think a lot of this stuff came from the military and these band of brother attitudes, there's only so much you can do below your rank, and so really there's a culture issue that has to be addressed in the sheriff's department. So for Eric, Eric has sought me out. We absorbed him from Compton Police Department, which, by the way, had a number of people working for Death Row Records and all, and it's probably one of the most corrupt agencies in the nation. I mean, I'm not sure what he did about that, but I'm just saying that, once he came to the organization, I considered Eric a friend, and I mentored him, and he reached out to me periodically, and I don't really have. He's just trying to win a race, and I think he, like Alex, he's a lieutenant, and he doesn't have the broad base of experience and knowledge, and he won't command respect amongst the troops because he hasn't really earned that respect. He doesn't really know how to develop policy, how to lead command staff. He's never been a captain. How are you going to lead 120 captains and above in the largest sheriff's department in the world, and you came from Compton Police Department? So I think it's, I think he's really trying to make my strengths weaknesses, and I think when you look at the fact that I've been sought out for high profile, very complex public service delivery jobs since I retired. And by the way, I've had to go through backgrounds for each and every one of them. And there are only 2 people at the airport that have secret level clearance with the FBI, and that's me and the FBI agent. So I had to go through another background for that. So I think he's trying to win a race at my expense, but I don't think. In fact, I'm pretty sure there's never been a more qualified person to actually run for this particular office in history.
Back to Compton. During that period of time, that was a bit of. It was a situation where Omar Bradley had initially lost to Mayor Paradin, and then it switched, and there was some election issue. We're talking about the early 2000s here, and at that time, you was the captain of that station, correct?
Correct.
And you was in the running for city manager at that time, weren't you?
Well, that's a whole nother story. I can touch on that. They didn't ask me to come back to be the city manager for 20 years, but I'll tell you, one day Omar had a special meeting and made me the city manager because he was firing Eric's former city manager. And under the charter, the chief of police usually acts as a city manager until there's a new one appointed. And so they appointed me to be the city manager, which I called the city manager at the time, a guy named Howard Caldwell, and said, Howard, I'm not the city manager. And he goes, all right, I'll be down there. And that was an interesting time working in Compton.
Because since I'm reading the articles about during that time, it looked like it was an uncomfortable situation to be in, given the circumstances. I think at one point a reporter described you as smiling through winced eyes. Having to explain having a meeting in the sheriff's substation, I think under those circumstances, when Omar Bradley, who I think eventually got charged with corruption of some sort, right?
Yeah. He actually called a city council meeting and held it in my conference room over there, and they made me the city manager, which was, And then the next day I came to work and everybody was locked out of City Hall and they were asking me to sign checks and stuff. I'm like, I'm not the city manager, It was a very uncomfortable situation. But I will tell you, one of the most rewarding experiences of my life have been working in Compton and Willowbrook and those areas, and really working with folks out there to make the area better. And by the time I left as captain, we were bringing in Starbucks, and that was like a feather in my hat. I was like, because they're not coming unless the crime rate's down enough. And so I really felt good about that. And then 20 years later, coming back and learning how to do economic development and bring in housing and jobs and businesses, I think, it's just very rewarding. Very rewarding.
Under Governor Jerry Brown, after he eliminated the community redevelopment districts, and he also had initiated realignment, I think to reduce the number of prisoners in state prisons, and so as a result, they end up in local jails and ran by the sheriff's department. I think that was under AB 109?
Correct.
How effective has AB 109 been, and how effective have we been able to be in rehabilitating, or at least reducing recidivism rates through AB 109?
Yeah, I mean, I was on the Community Corrections Partnership group, which was a committee mandated by that law, and I was the sheriff's representative in that, and went back and forth to Sacramento. And that was one of the things we had concerns about, is how would we measure the recidivism, because the big problem is case management. So if I get released out to the community as a nonviolent, non-serious, non-sex offender, and I go into a rehab program and I get a job through a community-based organization, am I reporting back to that group to let them know, hey, I've gotten a job, I got a family now? If they don't, the only way we could find out is if they were, reincarcerated, and we check, the database. I think there's some successes, but I think what has been lacking over the years is that we intuitively knew that people coming out, first of all, to go to prison here in California for a nonviolent, non-serious, non-sex offense, you've committed a lot of different crimes. Your arrest record's pretty big. And so you come out and you're either unemployable or underemployable. So I would imagine some of that has manifested itself in what we see in this homelessness issue, and then the money that came down to the community-based organizations to provide those rehabilitative services, I think was a little bit either lacking or they were not evidence-based. And so creating bigger programs, I think, are going to be key to that. And it kind of ties into the homelessness issues. How do you measure? It's hard to fix things that you don't measure. And so I think it had limited success, but I really would welcome a study to see the real facts and then what the challenges are. Rather than find out what went wrong, let's find out what went wrong and how to fix them.
Right. And speaking of homelessness and the role of the police officer sort of not expanding, it's just large altogether. What are your thoughts about reducing the size of responsibility of police officers and actually, not that it won't be out of the purview of law enforcement, but rather increase the actual skill sets that's not necessarily law enforcement centric in order to deal with the larger problems that police officers are asked to handle?
Right. Well, the model that's used now, using clinicians as well as homeless service providers. I created that in 2004 with the Community Oriented Policing Bureau. Whittier Narrows was one of the larger encampments at that time. And even at the airport, a large number of our calls for service involve people that are unhoused and mentally ill. I would love for public policymakers to put more resources, and not necessarily to defund the law enforcement agencies, but to really, because there's money out there that can fund more service providers in those genres to respond. Some of them will need protection, and so there will always be a role for us to kind of be around. But I would have loved, years ago, I was hoping that I could get, if someone is behaving like they're clearly having a mental health crisis out there, I'd rather the ambulance come rather than the police. Again, when we talk about what are the alternatives, where do you take them at that point? So alternatives to mental health outpatient facilities, alternatives to bridge housing. As a city manager, again, leaning back on that, it's very difficult to get policymakers to actually, and community members to say, okay, we'll take an alternative mental health facility in our community. They all want something done, but they don't want it in their area. And so that's one of the problems, capacity for us to take folks, or even the mental health professionals. Where are you going to take them?
And not to put it simply, for anybody not understanding, it's not like we have like these huge facilities and where there's mental health services being provided. At best, these things are being provided in community settings, in housing, like literally residential housing, and in very small numbers, but not in numbers large enough that really can service a population. That's what we're talking about here.
Right.
And this has been long running since the early 70s, and where we start seeing the closing down of large mental health facilities and in favor of more community settings, as well as changes in the law on who could be committed and how they're committed.
Right, and how long, right? So 5150 is actually a code that allows you to detain them for 72 hours. And so Norwalk Mental Health Facility has been shut down. Camp Murillo, Atascadero, which was actually a criminal mental health facility. All these places don't really exist any longer. And it really stems from back then, think one flew over the cuckoo's nest. People not really understanding how to really deal with mental health, and there's certain medications and methods that were used that were considered barbaric, and so they thought maybe outpatient services would be better. What didn't happen was the capacity wasn't built up in the community, and that's a problem.
What, in your mind, can be done on a policy level, I think, to address that? And what can be done maybe on a structural level to address that in your mind?
We're going to talk about crime reduction, but not in my methods are not in a way that we're not going to arrest everybody to stop crime reduction. So, the cops are often having to deal with folks who come from circumstances that we didn't create. And so, to your point, there is a tremendous amount of training provided to law enforcement officers on how to deal with the mentally ill, the autistic, people who are deaf and have certain, physical limitations. But what also needs to happen is we need to be trained on how to really engage the community as well as our policymakers on providing service delivery on a whole nother level. So, example, as a city manager, I used to always lecture my public works guys and say, look, kind of the broken window theory. If the city looks like nobody cares about it, you're going to get some of these behaviors. It all ties into like a psychological feeling of how you live and where you live. If nobody's taking care of it, then it manifests itself into certain behaviors. And so I want the deputies to understand what their role is in this huge public service provider environment. And they're just one cog in the wheel of all of this big umbrella. So, when you look at, for instance, I want the deputies to be able to identify someone who maybe needs a job. They're like, Rhambo, I need a job. That's why I'm out here. I did this or whatever. Well, there's a workforce investment board. There's a transitional, subsidized employment program where we give people jobs that have had criminal records. We pay the employer the money to give them those job training skills. But if you don't know that and you're not tied into that, then you don't understand the bigger picture of really how you're going to resolve the problem by creating a situation that eliminates the barrier. And so I had a Section 8 housing program in Compton. And so one of the things I really would like to do as a sheriff is we process about 2,000 people in and out of the jail a week. How many of those people are being touched by jail in reach to make sure that they're not going out to homelessness, that we're providing bridge housing to them, that they have all the things that are needed to get into the homeless integrated management system, the HIM system, which in and of itself is sometimes your own self's worst enemy, right? It's just difficult to get in these things. And the same with the civil management process. A lot of people forget when evictions happen, the sheriff's department has to go evict people. Right. Well, if I know that Cecil's going to get evicted, why don't I have my housing unit, which I'm going to form, come and talk to them before they're evicted so that they're not evicted out to homelessness? Right. Is it going to solve all the problem? No, but it'll certainly be an avenue for us to have opportunities to provide services to people before they even get back out to the street. So, I think, and I want to train the deputies to think that way, to think in a bigger picture of service delivery.
And there's another aspect to this too, in where I think residents are getting frustrated with, we pouring billions of dollars into homeless solutions, but not really seeing the results of it. Because, there's this thinking that you throw money at it, there's to be something fixed. But yet I have the experience of like being a security guard working at night and having to, work or deal with transient homeless folks who private property and transit don't quite work well together, because right. Property owners don't want them there. And I try to address the issue by calling 311, calling the county system to get them help. But it's just late at night. And there's nobody to call.
Right.
And I think a lot of times with residents, they have a hard time. Well, I know they need help. We have a government service that's supposed to provide it, but what can we do to reform the system in such a way in where residents can't, if they really want to do their part and be effective, connect folks to the services? What can be done at the county level to make that happen more effectively?
Yeah. Well, I've been going around to the mayoral debates, and the reason for that is because I want to see what the mayor of LA is going to do, what plans they have, because the county, when you think about county service delivery impacts everybody in the county hospital, county public health. It's a bigger umbrella. It encompasses the city of LA. So one, they have to be lockstep in sync and synchronize their efforts. The other one is building capacity. So when you have no one to call, so you can call the cops 24/7. That's why we're always used, because we're always there. So, but if you had a 24/7 mental health provider or a homeless service provider that's going to come out, and then you had someplace to take these folks, because a lot of folks out there don't want our help for a variety of reasons. But in the ones that are resistant to our help, at some point we have to really just say, look, we're not trying to criminalize the homeless. I get that. I don't want to do that. But at the end of the day, just for quality of life, I mean, we're loving these people to death, right? And so we have to, there have to be some alternatives where we can either, I do it at the airport. We have if you don't have a ticket, if you're not a ticketed passenger, after midnight and the airport's closed, you can't even be in the airport. So there was 120 or so people living in arrivals when I got there. And so now we've managed to keep that number down into the teens. And we know a lot of the unhoused. We know their families, and we've connected people from across the country. But at the end of the day, if they don't leave, we take them to jail, and I have a city prosecutor that is a quality of life prosecutor who provides them, rehabilitative services. They can plead out and basically put on like a probation and seek help. So you got to have consequences, for the actions.
But to be clear, 311 only service leads to 911. Literally, you get connected to services like homeless shelters that may be open that night, or rather, they have these hours, they're set hours.
Right.
That might be from 6 in the morning to maybe 5 in the afternoon. And so anytime after that, you're pretty much out of luck.
Right.
There are all these different services, but they require you to have a phone, an iPhone of some sort, or an Android in order to access it. A situation that may not necessarily be palpable for a person out there on the streets who don't have a phone, or have a charge phone, or have a place to charge their phone.
Right.
Right. And so it's just like, there's still too many things that are, too many dots that are not connected. To my mind, that makes it that much more difficult for those who really want to be of assistance and use the services that are there to make that work. And as a result, the default function then becomes 911.
Right. Well, and I travel a lot, and so when I'm around, I talk to the homeless and say, I was in New Orleans last year, and I talked to some homeless folks. I said, how come you don't go to the shelter? And he says, because one, I can't take all this stuff with me. And two, I have a dog, and three, they make you come in at a certain time, and there's certain rules that I really just can't adhere to. I don't like being around other people. Some of these guys are dangerous. And four, I have to leave in the morning and then get in line all over again. And so we create all these barriers, and I understand why there's rules. But at some point, we have to really realize that, what can we lift to make it easier, as you mentioned, to access these services, be able to utilize these services, and really provide some shelter for folks, and then really, make our streets, safer and cleaner and those kinds of things. And then offer them wraparound services. Pomona has an interesting concept out there. If you ever had a chance to go visit, as a city manager, I went and looked at their project. Very nice, very clean, large, and it's an industrial area. The problem is, where do you put that in an area that does not have that kind of space?
Aside from Eric Strong, there are at least 2 other candidates that you're running against. And I would like for you to take off the advantage that you have over your rivals running for the top job in the sheriff's department.
Yeah, actually there's 9.
There's
9 candidates, yeah. First of all, 4 or 5 of the 9 used to work for me. I outrank all of them. With the exception of Bob Luna, and even Bob, I have more experience, broad-based experience, and a diverse type of experience. Again, I mentioned that, having been a city manager sets me apart from all the other candidates. It actually sets me apart from the experience that any sheriff has actually had before they got the job. Peter Pitchess was a former FBI agent. So when you look in terms of overall public service delivery and experience, I'm head and shoulders above all of them. The other one is that I've not only worked for the county of Los Angeles, but I now work for an enterprise of the city of Los Angeles. So I have this tremendous base of relationships that I have on both sides of the municipal service delivery sector out here in LA. And then I have a huge number of community relationships and community ties, not only here in the basin, but also up in Antelope Valley, people in Malibu, Calabasas area, Catalina Island, so I have, no one has worked as many assignments or done as many things in terms of actually creating like youth intervention programs, prevention programs, running a weed and seed site, doing charitable things like raising money for, pediatric cancer care or handicapped foster care kids, So all of these things set me apart from, when you listen to the candidates, they all have to tell you, when I'm sheriff, I'm going to. I tell them, I've done all these things. My leadership and my integrity and things that I'm talking about were progressive when the term progressive didn't even exist. And I had been doing them 20 years ago.
Actually, as a final send-off for those who are looking for a good reason to vote for you, what do you have to say to LA County voters who are still trying to understand who's running and understanding? Like, what's the last word on the topic that you want to say to those who need a reason to vote for you?
Yeah, I would say, look, you get the government you vote for, not the one you deserve sometimes. And we're seeing that. Just be wise in your decisions. Look and see who has the best. So there's elections are not always a meritocracy, meaning the person with the most experience doesn't necessarily win the race. And I've really kind of stayed away from politics because it just seems like no matter who you vote for, there's always this default back to somebody does something and you're just disappointed. I think that for me particularly, we always want, why doesn't so-and-so run? Because they have all these qualifications, they're great character, but most of us don't want to be involved in the messiness of politics. And quite frankly, if you're a human being at any capacity, some of the things that are said about you and lies that are thrown out are, they're hurtful and they hurt your feelings and hurt your family. I would say this, take a look at the candidates, really be thoughtful in how you make your selection, and understand that when you elect a person like me, you're not electing just the sheriff or the chief of the sheriff's department. You're electing a person who's been a partner in the community for the last 45 years, who still lives in the community and still interacts with folks in the community. And I just love the work. I mean, at this point in my career, I really don't have to work. And so I just really, what are they going to say about you when you're dead, right? And so, do you really want to make a difference? And I do. And I wouldn't sacrifice all this time and effort into it if my heart and passion wasn't in for this entire community. And I think we can create a new normal, quite frankly.
Oh, that's right. Well, Mr. Rhambo, I appreciate you coming down here and having this long conversation with me and looking at the sheriff's department and policy and everything else. Thank you so much.
I appreciate you, and I appreciate you guys being patient because I had some long-winded answers. So thank you very much.